So today I'll be showing you how to make this cross pattern at the end of your bone casing. And I understand that I'm working on a thinner and more flexible fabric, as well as not a real corset. So when you are doing this, you'll be working on your actual corset. This will be your boning channel, and you'll be adding this to the bottom. We'll assume that the bottom edge is where our piping lives. So for this, you are going to need a few different items. So some tools that you're going to need today when you start doing your flossing is some embroidery floss. You can find this at either Michael's, the dollar store, or one of the stores on Queen West. I prefer to use DMC brand. I understand that mine is a little bit tangled, but yours will probably be much less tangled when you're buying it new. Feel free to use whatever color you like for this, or whatever color you feel complements your 19th century corset, whether you're using the beige, the white, or the gray fabric. Pick something that you feel is appropriate and that really speaks to you, because this is the only time where we're really adding something decorative and embroidery-like to the corset. You'll also want to have a pair of scissors, a pencil, a ruler. Your clear flexible ruler will be great, as well as a hand sewing needle. Now you want your hand sewing needle to be relatively thin and sharp because your coutil is very thick, so you want something that can easily slip sharply right between those threads, but you'll probably need a thimble when doing this, as the coutil and the boning is very stiff. So go ahead and get yourself a nice sharp sewing needle for hand sewing. Alright, so when you're working on your corset, you'll actually have a very stiff, very stable surface to be adding your flossing to. Because I'm working on a thinner piece of fabric to show this example, I'm actually going to be working with my embroidery hoop so that you can see it nice and flat. I'm also going to just indicate at the bottom of my drawn-in boning channel here where my piping would live, so that I can show you how you'll be adding the flossing to your corset above that piping. So I've just drawn a little line in there, and we can pretend that that line is actually where the bottom edge of my corset is and my piping lives. So at this point, your corset already has a bone inserted into this boning channel, and we'll assume that these pencil lines are my stitch marks. You'll be sewing from the right side of your corset, so you do want to be on the outside, non-pencil marking side of your corset when you're adding this flossing, and you're going to be adding it at the bottom of the bone casing channel here. Now we'll assume that this is our piping seam line. You want to work about 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch above that line. It should be relatively where your bone ends, especially since we added a little bit of space for ease of our bones. If you've pushed your bone all the way down to the bottom, that's okay. Your bone will still be able to move freely underneath this. This just reinforces the end of your bone casing. So it's okay if it sits a little bit above or right to the piping. The first thing we want to do is indicate that 1/4 inch to 3/8 inch mark above our piping line here with our ruler, and how we're going to do that is measure up 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch above that line, or on your corset above the piping seam, and you're going to put a dot on each side of your bone casing just inside the stitch lines. So you should have a little mark on each side inside of the stitch lines, not on the outside, because all of our stitches will remain between these two stitch lines of our bone casing. Now some flossing extends a little bit higher. In my example, mine is 3/4 of an inch high. Now yours can be anywhere from 3/4 of an inch to an inch to 1.25 inches. Basically, you want to have the same length of flossing no matter what bone it's on for evenness and continuity, but I'm going to stick with my example of 3/4 of an inch high. Now you're going to measure up 3/4 of an inch from where you drew those first 2 dots, and you're going to add another 2 dots on the inside of each side of your bone casing. So I'll make those a little darker there. Now your fabric, you want to use a sharp pencil for this, so your dots don't have to be as pronounced as mine, just enough so you can see where you will be stitching between, because you're going to be making a cross of stitching between these dots. Now you can put your corset aside for a second, and we're going to work with our embroidery floss and our needle. So you no longer need your ruler, you can put that aside as well, but you want to pull out your scissors, and you'll also want to have your needle, and thread. So your embroidery floss, you're going to take a length that is approximately, or at least, the length of your full arm measurement. So you can go all the way from fingertip to armpit in terms of a full arm measurement. And you don't want it to be too long, because what we're going to do to use this embroidery floss is we're actually going to split this strand into smaller strands. You'll be able to get 3 flossing crosses done out of this one length. Because the embroidery floss is so thick, we actually want to unravel the threads of it. And generally there are 6 threads that make up embroidery floss. So you want to isolate 2 of those threads away from the rest and unravel it so that you're only working with 2 out of 6 of these threads. And then if you want to split the other 4 threads into 2 threads as well, that's fine, because those can be used for your next flossing crosses as well. So you'll be doing 4 flossing crosses. Now, a good way of approaching flossing is to actually practice it on a piece of scrap fabric before you approach your final corset to do it. Because otherwise, if you make a mistake on your corset, you might leave stitch holes and pencil marks that are not so great. So it is good to do a little practice on maybe a piece of coutil that you have from cutting out your corset, some extra, or any waste fabric that you might find in the studio, just so that you're not approaching your good finished corset without a little experience in stitching the cross. So the next thing that you have to do is push these 2 threads through the eye of your needle. And because your eye of your needle is very small, you're going to want to have a good method of threading your needle. If you have a needle threader, they're super helpful in this scenario. If not, you will just want to try and make the tip of your 2 threads as smooth as possible. You can add a little saliva to it to help, or a little bit of moisture, and also just try and make them nice and small and sharp to get through here. Okay, now the next thing you want to do is fold your thread in half, but leave one tail a little shorter than the other, and you're actually going to knot the longest end, because we're working with one single strand here. We're not doubling that in half. We're going to sew with just 1/2 of what you've pulled through here. So we'll go ahead and do a little knot. However you like to make your knot is fine. So you should have one tail end and a knotted end. Now you're going to clip the thread tail off your knot, and you want to make that knot nice and tiny and as clean as possible, because we're going to be hiding that knot under our flossing stitches. So make sure that you make your knot as small as possible and as neat as possible. It doesn't have to be the biggest knot. Coutil is very thick, and it's just to hold your flossing stitches in place. Okay, so once you have the knot made in your thread and your tails snipped nice and close to that knot, we're actually ready to start sewing the cross. Now, where you're going to start is in this bottom right dot. You are going to sink your needle just above the knot, not very far, maybe a couple threads in the weave of the coutil higher than that first dot, inside of the stitching line of your bone casing. So you want to keep all of your stitches inside those 2 lines of stitching. So make sure they don't extend beyond the stitching. You want to stay inside of them. You're also going through the top layer of fabric. You're not going under the bone and around the bone. You're staying on top of that bone, on the outside fabric. You don't have to sink it underneath the bone. So you're going to sink your needle into the fabric just above the dot in the bottom right corner here, and you're going to take your needle back out through the opposite side of the boning channel here in the bottom left corner, and you're exiting below the dot on the bottom left side. So you're starting above the right bottom dot and you're exiting below the left bottom dot. So you're gonna pull that through there. Make sure it's nice and tight. If you feel like your knot has a little bit extra of a tail there that's kind of sticking out, you can always trim it down, and that's totally fine. You want to make it nice and small, neat as possible. You just pull all those fuzzies off. Okay. Now your next hole that you're going through is the top right hole. So you're actually going to go diagonally up, and you're going to enter just above that right dot. Just a couple threads in the weave above that dot. And you're going to sink your needle in there, and your needle is going to come out on the opposite side over here above the left top dot. And again, you're just a couple threads above that dot in the fabric. And now you also want to make sure that your needle is parallel. You should be working straight across here and straight across down here from now on, keeping those lines parallel and crossing diagonally between them. So you sink your needle straight across, you come out, and you pull your thread nice and tight. Now we're going to return back to our first dot down here in the bottom right, but this time we're going to enter it in the bottom right corner, and we're going in just below that dot. So we're actually skipping past our knot here and going through the bottom half, parallel with where we entered on the opposite side here. So you want to enter just below that bottom right dot. And now when you come up on the opposite side from the bottom right dot in the bottom left corner, you're actually going to bring your needle up just to the inside of this thread here. You want to make sure that you start to fan your threads across this way and this way now, but we're going to be staying in these same holes of the weave up here. So you're coming up just inside the bottom left here. You're going to pull that nice and tight. And now we're going back up to this same dot up here in this top right corner, going across parallel to the opposite corner up here in the top left through the same holes that we went through originally. And we're pulling that out. Now we're going to come back down to the bottom right dot, and we're going just inside towards the left here of our stitch that we made in the bottom right corner below our knot and below that bottom right dot. So you're going just inside of it, or to the left of it, and you're coming up parallel across just inside of the last bottom stitch that you made over here. So you can pull your needle through, and what's going to happen now is as you continue doing this pattern, these bottom stitches will move closer and closer together towards each other, while these two dots up here and these two stitches remain as far apart as they always have been. So it makes a fan in this corner and a fan in the opposite corner. So I'm going back through the same holes in the top, staying parallel, coming out of the same holes in the weave, pulling nice and tight, coming back down just inside of my bottom right corner, coming up just inside of my bottom left corner, and I'm going to continue doing that same parallel X pattern. Go top, diagonal down, across the bottom, and diagonal up and across, until this bottom corner here measures approximately 1/8 of an inch. That little triangle down here. We want that to be about 1/8 of an inch. We don't quite want it to be touching. We want to keep the X as this nice beautiful pattern here. But we also want to have that nice fan at the bottom with these nice sharp points at the top. So you're going to bring that thread down into the bottom corner again here. Now, what's going to happen next is you're actually going to have to pull your cross just out of the way here for a moment. You can do that with a pin. You can anchor a pin just to pull it out of the way if you need to. So I'll do that here, just while we're doing this. Whoop. Is I'm just moving my cross out of the way there. Because what we're going to do is come through our bottom here and up underneath this fan of stitching so we can tie off our thread and then cut our knot so that it is invisible. So we're coming back down, and you'll just want to make sure that if you have a pin in there, you keep clear of that. So you're just inside there, and you're coming up where your stitches would normally live over here, but underneath them. So I've pulled my threads out of the way with that pin, and I've come up right there so that when I push them back across, they will hide my knot. To knot my thread, I'm just catching maybe a single thread in my fabric's weave, and then I'm making a little loop, so I'm not pulling it all the way through, just leaving a little loop here so that I can go through it and through it again with my needle, pulling it tight so that it's a nice small knot in my fabric. I'm going to go ahead and cut my tail nice and close to that knot with my snips. So I have a very nice little knot just right there. And now I'm going to pull that pin out that's holding my stitches in place. And I'm just going to carefully, with my finger, I'm going to push those threads back where they want to be, hiding my knot underneath them so that my knot is invisible. You also might have to push some of the threads on the opposite side to get it where they need to be. In the end, what you'll have is this really beautiful cross pattern. It takes a little finesse to get all of the threads back where they should be. But once you've got it, it looks quite nice. So now you're ready to move on to your next flossing bone. So you're going to do this 4 times. On each side of the center front, there's going to be one on each bone, and on each side of the center back, there'll be one on each bone. So just remember that you only have to do 4 of these for your corset sample, but you're more than welcome to do more if you'd like to. And in your final corset, you could put them on every bone if you wanted to. All right, and you're all done.